The views and opinions expressed on this program are not those of Norfolk State University or WNSB-FM. Thank you for listening.
It's Hampton Roads Voices. Hot 91.
MLK Day is an American federal holiday marking the birthday of Martin Luther King, which is January 15th, and this would be his 90th birthday. But in the Trump era, what does the MLK holiday mean to African Americans then and now? Should we continue to celebrate MLK Day? And in the Trump era, do African Americans still have to fight even more for the principles and views of social justice of Dr. King? Hi, everybody. I'm Benita Adams, and today on Hampton Roads Voices, we celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But how has the fight changed in light of the Trump era and administration and the Me Too movement? Coming up next, where do we go from here on Hot 91?
It's Hampton Roads Voices. Hot 91.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Benita Adams, and this is Hampton Roads Voices, where people speak life into their community. Well, we know that this is going to be the commemoration and celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King. His birthday was January 15th, 1929, and he would be 90 years old. And so our question today is, where do we go from here, celebrating the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King? We really want to hear from you. Our number, let me give that to you right off the bat, 757-823-9110, 757-823-9110. Do you think we should continue to celebrate the ideals of Dr. King? What do you think in combination with the Me Too movement? And how are you going to participate in this day of service, even if it's attending events? Again, that number, 757-823-9110. Our first in-studio guest is Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander. She's the Dean of Norfolk State University's College of Liberal Arts, and she is a historian. Thank you, Dr. Newby Alexander, for being here today.
Thank you so much.
So I'm excited to have this conversation. I know a lot of people are having the conversation, but I still think that every year we need to refresh our memories. We need to think about, what does this really mean? And right before we started the show, I said I was going to ask you the question, and that is, do we romanticize Dr. King and all of his ideas and ideals and what this means?
I think absolutely we romanticize him, and then in the romanticizing, we forget the message. Mm-hmm. We forget what he really represents for not just African Americans, but for the nation as a whole. I always say that when a person dies, they become a saint. Mm-hmm. And so we put a sainthood on him. And so when information came out about his sexual indiscretions with individuals as he toured the South and went other places, that message made him look like a hypocrite. Mm-hmm. And it diluted what he really represented. And in so many ways, what King represented is what President Obama represented, mm-hmm. which is a leader who's willing to say, stand up, and not follow me, but stand up and join me. Mm-hmm. You know, King said, be the change that you want mm-hmm. to see. And that's really what King was saying. His message was, let us all move together collectively to demand these rights. They cannot ignore the collective. They can ignore the individual. They can ignore small groups. But not if we all stand together, and we stand locked arm in arm. And we stand not with hate, but we stand with love, but also determination to change the world.
Now, has the collective, you said not the individual, but the collective, has the collective changed? Are we as it were, as collective, as much of a group as we were back during Dr. King's time? Or does it seem like we're more individualized?
Well, you know, we never were that united. The whole thing of romanticizing our past and the civil rights movement is kind of interesting as well, because the overwhelming majority of people did not participate in the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. And whether it's African Americans or Jewish people or whites, the overwhelming majority did not participate. They stood or sat on the sidelines. Many were afraid. Many thought that the change that people were advocating was too radical, that would somehow disrupt their comfort zones. And I'm talking now about African Americans. And so he always was part of a small contingency of dedicated people who were trying to make a difference. And of course, the overwhelming majority of people who made a difference were the grassroots folks. And so when we think about these last midterm elections, when we think about the special elections that were held in 2018, and there were upsets in the voting, and I don't mean upsets in terms of there was voter fraud, but rather the people they weren't expecting to win won the election. It was because the people in those communities decided to stand up and to vote for a person that they believed really represented their interests. So instead of sitting on the sidelines, they stood up because they felt an urgency. Now, can you maintain that urgency at all times? No, that it's impossible. But I believe that there are periods in our history when it is important, it's necessary to stand up and be counted and be part of a group collective. And so King represented that time period when thousands of people in communities throughout this country were standing up and making a difference, just as Frederick Douglass represented that, not only among those enslaved people who fled, but also in the post-Reconstruction period of those who were continuing, even though they were losing ground, they were continuing to fight for their civil rights. And so you will see these individuals that we'll point out and say, they were the leaders, but it's really they represented and they became the voice of thousands of leaders throughout the communities of people who were willing to stand up and say no. Sometimes they win, sometimes there's a setback, but when you see this individual or when you hear the voices of the multitude, they will come out and stand up. And so it's every 20 to 25 years that you see that happening.
I find it intriguing that you say, can we sustain that? But life has cycles.
Yes.
Societies have cycles.
Yes.
And so we can't stay at a 100 metaphorically all the time. Ebbs and flows. And I find that very interesting. Now, let me give you the number, 757-823-9110, 757-823-9110. What do you think about the Martin Luther King holiday that we're getting ready to celebrate next week? How are you being involved with that? What participation or events are you involved with? And how do you think, as African Americans, we are progressing socially, spiritually, economically, and educationally? Give us a call, 757-823-9110. So I want to go back just a little bit, Dr. Newby Alexander. And when you say that Dr. King, which I know we know that intellectually, as opposed to emotionally, that Dr. King was a man. And yet, sometimes we don't allow that for some of our other leaders, especially in the Me Too movement and those kinds of things. We want to not allow them to make any excuses for their private lives. So how do we reconcile those kinds of things?
I don't know that you can really reconcile those things. You can say these were weaknesses in their character, in their personalities, and their behaviors. Dr. King was not only a civil rights leader, he was a minister. And so people see those behaviors as a failing of his oath to serve the Lord and to conduct his life in a blameless fashion. And we recognize that. And you find, I always tell people I'm a historian. Right. So we see the good, the bad, the ugly in human beings, including incredibly powerful and change agent human beings. And he was one of them who had flaws. You look at the FBI reports, you look at some of the secret tapes and so forth, and you see that we want to think of him as someone who was never afraid. Right. But we forget that the person that we see, that we venerate, Jesus, and you think of the Garden of Gethsemane.
Right.
He was afraid during that time. He was afraid to go through what he had to go through. That's very human. That's something that you can identify with. And that's why in the story of Jesus, the whole idea of him being human and showing that even when you are human, even when you make mistakes, even when you are flawed, you can still carry on the will of God. That is life transforming for a lot of people. And so I think that this notion that either a hero is all good and a villain is all evil,
right,
flies in the face of humanity. And that's why our heroes are placed on pedestals rather than down here where they belong, which is with the people. And I think Dr. King needs to be with the people, and he needs to be someone we can identify with, that when we have failings, when we have flaws, that we accept, acknowledge that, move on, which he did. I understand he did accept and acknowledge that. We move on, and it does not change our course. Ultimately, Dr. King said he was willing to die for what he believed for this cause. And even when he knew that people were gunning for him, he decided to say, yes, I will accept this challenge. And I think that that kind of willingness to sacrifice yourself for what you believe in is something that in a capitalist society we don't see too often.
Absolutely.
But this is the character that we should revere and want to somehow adopt in our own lives. And so it's that and many other points that I would say we need to talk about Dr. King, and we need to talk about him as a human being.
As a human.
But as someone who also did great things.
Absolutely. You're hearing from right now Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander. She's the Dean of Norfolk State's University Colleges of Liberal Arts, and she's a historian. And we're here asking you the question, where do we go from here? Celebrating the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We want to hear from you, 757-823-9110. This is Hot 91.
Hot 91 commemorates the 90th birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. with a quote from Dr. King. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word. We commemorate the 90th birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on Hot 91.
Is Hampton Roads Voices on Hot 91.
If you're just joining us, I'm Benita Adams, and we're talking about celebrating the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King. His birthday, of course, is January 15th. And he was born in 1929. He would be 90 years old. So we're asking you, where do we go from here? And to help us unpack all of this and answer those questions for us, we have Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander. She's the Dean of the Norfolk State University's College of Liberal Arts and a historian. Now, we want to hear from you as well. Let me ask you to call in, 757-823-9110. 757-823-9110. How do you feel about the Dr. King's legacy in light of economically, socially, spiritually, educationally, and the things that we're dealing with now in connection with the Trump administration or the Obama administration? Again, the number 757-823-9110. Now, Dr. Newby Alexander, during the break, I was saying, well, what major points do you want to bring up? And you were talking about the I Have a Dream speech. And you were saying that we only listen to that, that part that everybody hears. But you made a point that there's so much more to that speech. And I want to unpack that a little bit because I think that really reflects on what we're doing, especially as African Americans now. Go ahead and tell us a little bit.
Well, with the I Have a Dream speech, everyone hears when King says, I have a dream that one day my children, et cetera, et cetera. But there's so much more to the speech than that people have forgotten or simply didn't listen to. And they're expecting that the schools are going to teach all this information when many people have no concept of this information. In fact, Norfolk State University is one of the few universities that requires that its students take courses that deal with some aspect of African or African American history.
Excellent.
And it was because the students in the 1970s campaigned and demanded of the administration that they create courses such as the African American history courses that are now at least 2 courses, the African history courses, we have African American art courses, African American music, African American literature, so that people come to the table with information, not mythology, not stereotypes that they get from all these television shows or listening to people, but rather with hardcore facts. Because it's the facts that help you to unpack your truth. And so in unpacking this truth about the I Have a Dream speech, what we see is that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said 3 basic things that I think it is important that we remember. And the first thing is he talked about economic injustice, that the nation promised African Americans the same that they promised immigrants coming in from Europe, and even now from Latin America or from Asia, and yet have failed to deliver on that promise. African Americans are still being redlined, where they're having to pay more for insurance. They're still living in food desert communities where they have to drive or ride the bus for maybe an hour to go to a grocery store or a department store or even a drugstore. And the only convenience stores that are near them sell more alcohol than they do food.
Absolutely.
And so African Americans, as far as King was concerned, were still owed economic equality, not economic handouts. That's always the argument against economic equality. Oh, so you mean you want handouts? No, we want equality.
Equality.
That means equal opportunity. So when you look, for example, at the number of minority contractors who don't get contracts to build roads or whatever, in part because they've never had an opportunity to get the first contract, and now they're competing with these big contractors who've had the contracts for years.
Absolutely.
So they're not even on an equal footing, and yet they try to put their bids in for the same thing. So that's just in 1 or 2 examples. The other thing that he argued was that African Americans needed to look internally and say, when you're coming to the table and you're demanding social justice, do not come to the table with what is expected, which is hate, anger, fury. In fact, one of the things that you hear from a lot of conservatives who are always vilifying those who are out there now advocating for civil rights is that they're terrorists. They're demanding handouts. They are ignoring their own social responsibilities. They're killing their own people in their communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
And so what King was saying was that when you come to the table, essentially don't get played. Don't allow other people to get you to come to the table angry and to come to the table without some self-control. But instead, come to the table knowing exactly what you want, be in control of yourself, and have a very, very specific goal.
Right.
And then the final thing that he included in his speech was social justice, that we must be a nation of social justice. We cannot claim to be the land of the free and the home of the brave, and that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and we have social injustice.
Right.
And social justice also has been a favorite word that's used, but it's very seldom actually implemented.
What does it look like?
So when we go to the courts, two people, a black person and a white person accused of the same crime, social justice should provide them with the same penalty. Or social justice will consider the situation that both of them were in and maybe for one provide a slightly different penalty than the other because of extenuating circumstances. But what we end up doing in our society is basically labeling, and you see this in the courts, labeling people of African descent as people beyond redemption.
Yes, I was going to say that.
So the social justice is never applied in their case. In fact, the maximum sentence is applied. And then once we put the person in the system, in the penitentiary system, in the legal system, they never can get out. Never. Because they're always being punished for the same crime, in perpetuity.
So I hear what you're saying, and I agree, but let's just add to that a little bit. I don't really like the term devil's advocate, but I'll say that so we'll understand that. But in the social justice part, then where does this, if we know that as African American people, if we know that these things that you mentioned, economic injustice, social justice, and so forth, if we know that there is a discrepancy in the system, where does the personal responsibility come in? Should it not be in our thinking that I know I will not be treated fairly, so therefore, what about that part?
Well, I think that for a lot of people, they've given up. Because they grow up in an environment that already treats them like they are marginal, that they're unimportant. And I think it's a lot to expect that people will suddenly somehow rise to the same level and perspective that you or I may have, because we grew up in a very different environment with different levels of expectations and so forth. I think that the responsibility belongs across the board. It doesn't just rest with the person who may be committing or accused of a crime. It lays with all of us. So it's with the police officer. What do they bring to the table? Do they bring the perspective that black people automatically are criminals and therefore I should be afraid of them and ready to kill them the moment they move? Whether the police officer is black or white, because the society has created this image that black people in certain situations are always criminals. Is responsibility just with the individual who's growing up in a hopeless environment in which there are no role models, there are no positive role models for them, that they're struggling, that they don't have access to jobs, they don't have access to education that actually believes in them and believes that they can succeed. They don't have access to the things that are basic to success. And then we're suddenly expecting them to jump up and be successful.
Exactly.
You're going to get a very small percentage of people out of that to actually be successful, because most people can't overcome that insurmountable, it seems, for some people, insurmountable obstacles. And so what are we doing to, yes, take personal responsibility, but apply that across the board? If it's not applied across the board, it won't work at any juncture. So I'm personally an advocate, and I know that King was also an advocate of equal education. Why are we funding education unequally? Why are we using the tax base? First of all, we're taking all poor people and we're segregating them in these huge communities. So we're locking them into cyclical poverty, because in those huge poverty-stricken communities, you don't have job opportunities. You don't have easy access to public transportation.
That's right. The food deserts, as you mentioned.
Right. You have limited opportunities, and you have poor school systems or poor schools without the resources needed. And then you're expecting the same kind of performance from them as a person growing up with all kinds of supports around them. Why aren't we providing after-school programs for young people, not just for athletics, but for math and science and for reading and for history and taking field trips and having an opportunity to study abroad and to see a different world? Most of the time when people live in those communities, they've actually never left the city.
Oh, yes,
and yet
absolutely.
we're expecting that somehow they have this broader perspective. And so King was really an advocate. These are all components of social justice.
Right.
That if you put enough obstacles in front of a person, you will probably get the results you desire. And so we must change the way that we see and operate in our society, and that begins at every level, both at the legislative, at the judicial, as well as at the social and community level. And the other thing is voting. You know, all the civil rights advocates were strong supporters of voting. In fact, here at Norfolk State University, when they had the poll tax, of course, that was eliminated by 1965. But when they had the poll tax, there was a movement among the students here to pay the poll tax and to help pay the poll tax for their fellow students so that they could begin voting as a block, so that their voices could matter. And I think that, unfortunately, a lot of young people are convinced that their vote doesn't matter.
Oh, a lot of people.
And most of the time they refer to the presidential election and to the Electoral College. And I remind them that that is the only election in which the Electoral College is a factor. All the other elections are one person, one vote. And so when you have relinquished your responsibility as a citizen in a democracy to vote, you give over your power and you release control over your life that usually is in a very negative way.
A lot to unpack, a lot to think about. We're talking about where do we go from here, celebrating the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and we're listening to Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander, the Dean of Norfolk State University's College of Liberal Arts. We also want to hear from you, 757-823-9110. What are you thinking about the King holiday, and how are you participating on Hot 91?
Is Hampton Roads Voices on Hot 91.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Benita Adams. We're talking about celebrating Dr. Martin Luther King. Where do we go from here, celebrating his 50th anniversary? And we want to hear from you, 757-823-9110. How do you see us making the strides as African-American people, as women, as a community? Give us a call, 757-823-9110. And answer the question as you call in. Do you think the mission of Dr. King is still relevant for the younger generation? 757-823-9110. Dr. Newby Alexander, I want to ask you that question. Is Dr. King's message still relevant for this young generation?
I think absolutely is still relevant, but I think that the younger generation really don't know who he was. They don't really know what he said. They know the one little part of a longer speech. But they don't know, for example, when he, in 1967, stood up, knowing that he would be vilified. He stood up and said, I'm against the Vietnam War. I'm against it because it creates a conflict of conscience. Why are we there fighting in this war, killing people in their homeland over what?
Right.
What have they done against us? He considered that war to be an immoral war, And as a result of his stance, he was vilified. He was called a communist. He was called a traitor to the nation. And this is not just coming from whites, but it was coming from blacks as well. And I always remember a part in the Bible where it says, having done all to stand therefore.
Right.
And so that's what he did. And many young people, especially those that I see coming to Norfolk State University, want to make a difference not only in their personal lives, but in their community. So many are coming to Norfolk State with an idea of changing the world through advocating social justice.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say to them that King's message to them, in fact, he said that his conscience left him with no other choice. And I think that when we understand that when you take a stand for what you believe is right, other people will vilify you for that stance.
Oh, absolutely.
But at the end of the day, what will remain? And the one thing that will remain is truth and love. And I see the love that so many young people have for their community and their desire to help be those change agents for their community. And so I think it's time that we start reflecting on King and how he inspired so many to be change agents in their community. They didn't have to follow him in lockstep. The idea was inspiring them to make a difference.
So for the younger generation, you were saying some of them, perhaps they don't know who Dr. King really was,
Yes.
what his ideals were, and so forth. Is there a time now for new leadership, but maybe saying the same thing, but in new package for the younger generation?
I think every generation has the challenge to step up to the plate and to put on the table what is their agenda. And some generations have capitulated and not done that. But I think it is critical that all generations realize that it's your time and you put the change that you want to see on the table and then you move forward. And so for King, I had to take a step backward when you reminded everyone that he'll be, if he was still alive, he'd be 90. My father was born in 1929 as well. And that generation made a big difference. My father was the first African American to be licensed to practice internal medicine in the city of Norfolk. And he was one of a handful of physicians who was licensed to practice internal medicine, which was really a new field in the late 50s, early 60s. And he decided he was going to make a difference in his community by advocating for change and advocating for integration and advocating for equality and so forth. And so he was part of King's generation. They were a generation that grew up in segregation. They grew up with discrimination facing them every single day. They pooled their resources to create institutions that would help them. So today, there are a whole different set of challenges facing young African Americans, young Hispanic Americans, young white Americans. So what are those challenges and what do you want to do? What change do you want to happen in your community that will make a difference? And so I think that for young people, they can look at him as an inspiration as to the steps that he took, but the willingness that the willingness to sacrifice, that's a key component to changing your world.
And I think it's important that you say that because I would hope that the older generation, sometimes they say, well, we did it this way, so you should do it this way, and we did it this way. But you're saying the challenges are different.
Yes.
But some of the values can be the same and can be demonstrated, but just in a different way.
That's why metaphors are important.
Yes.
Because metaphors don't tell you how to do it. They just tell you about the principles.
Right.
And the ideas. And so King is not a metaphor. He was a real person. But what he did can be used as a metaphor for how we can change our world. Mm-hmm. But you first have to decide that you're willing to sacrifice.
That's right.
And that the change that you want to see is worth that sacrifice.
That's right. Is it worth the sacrifice? And it really goes back to what you had said a little bit earlier, I think at the top of the show, how it appears as if everybody was on board with the movement in the 60s and 50s and so forth. But there were limited numbers. Some people said, I absolutely don't believe in this, or I'm not willing to make the sacrifice.
Right. There was tremendous fear. I mean, people who were African American and they were working in white companies, or they were working for whites, if they were members of the NAACP, for example, the state legislature had actually created a special committee to get the list of the names of people who were members of the NAACP, and they were going to have all these individuals fired for even being members. And we're talking the 1960s. We're not talking the 1920s here. And this was actually done by law, that the legislature had that kind of power that they were willing to do that. We had lawyers such as Joe Jordan, whose office was raided, and he was a follower and a supporter of Martin Luther King Jr., but his office was raided trying to get the names of the people who were members of the NAACP or with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference or any of these other organizations, because there was such a desire to intimidate people from being members of those organizations, in the same way that there's an effort to vilify people who are members of the Black Lives Matter organization, vilifying them as terrorists, as anti-American, or even Kaepernick doing something as simple as kneeling. They're characterizing that as treasonous. And so there's always an effort to marginalize, vilify people who are trying to say something about how the nation needs to be changed, and they're willing to sacrifice that. Willing
to sacrifice. Our number is 823-9110. Do you think the mission of Dr. King is still relevant for younger generations, as he talked about the nonviolence movement, and have times changed? And where do you think African Americans would be if Dr. King continued to lead? For example, I Am a Man movement and the Poor People's Movement. Give us a call, 757-823-9110. 757-823-9110. Call in and let us know. How do you think the movement is going? Have we progressed as African Americans? And how are you going to celebrate Dr. King? 757-823-9110. So you mentioned, Dr. Newby Alexander, that we need to have leaders for that generation. But if King had continued to lead, would he have had to change his strategy because times were changing? Or what do you think?
I think King was absolutely changing his strategies while he was still alive. What he did in the 1950s was not what he did in the 1960s. And when he broke with this lockstep approach to whatever the government wants in terms of foreign policy, I'll support, when he began to move away from that starting in 1965, but really taking a stand by 67, he was moving in a very different direction. King was starting to realize that segregation was a national issue. It wasn't just a Southern issue. It was just more visible in the South.
Yes.
But he was also seeing with the I Am a Man movement and the Poor People's Movement that the issue was also economic. And unless we address that economic disparity and the economic discrimination, that having access to a restaurant without being able to afford to go to that restaurant is inconsequential. And so he shifted his focus, not completely leaving his focus, of course, on social justice, but shifting that focus, emphasizing more the economic disparity. You know, this is what the Black Power movement did. They focused a lot on economic disparity.
They did.
Had he not been killed, I believe he would have continued, and there would have been, he would not have become a black radical in the same way that many, such as Angela Davis and others, were radicals, but he would have had more in common with them because he was moving more in the direction of focusing on economic disparity, and we still have tremendous economic disparity today.
So I know it's about time for us to wrap up with your segment, but let's just take that one little part to end on. What do we do? Where do we go in terms of taking these principles, ideals, and so forth to work on that part of it, the economic disparities?
One of the most important things that we can do as citizens of this country is vote, but also be involved. You have city council representatives. You have a mayor. You have representatives in the General Assembly, both at the House level and at the Senate level. You have Congress people, you have senators, and of course you have a president. What are we advocating? What are we demanding? I have not heard any voices demanding specific things for the community. Must demand actual equally funded schools, programs that will really help the young people, a transportation system that makes sense, the elimination of food deserts that harm the entire community, not just the one that's part of the desert, but it harms the broader community. And then in Hampton Roads, where you have so many cities compressed into one location, we need to conserve our resources. So there must be a way to pool all those resources together so that the monies that are generated here can really help facilitate a much more vibrant and thriving Hampton Roads community, not just this fight between some of the cities over resources as if you're fighting over crumbs. You have a wealth of knowledge, information, resources available for everyone to enjoy. But if you're fighting to get all of those little pieces, the entire group suffers. And so I think that people should be active. How often are they going to PTA meetings to make sure that their children's educational needs are being met? How often do they go to city council meetings to advocate for their communities? Are they registered to vote? Are they out there voting? Are they sending letters and emails and text messages to their officials? That's how you can make a difference. And it doesn't cost a lot to make that sacrifice. All it takes is a moment of your time.
A moment of your time. You've been hearing from Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander. She's the dean here at Norfolk State University, the College of Liberal Arts, and he's a historian. And we've been talking about where do we go from here as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Newby Alexander, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Give us the number, 757-823-9110. Is there any contact information you'd like to give us for the College of Liberal Arts, in case anyone needs that number?
Yes, if you are interested in getting in touch with us and finding out about our myriad of programs, you can always find us on the website, which is www.nsu.edu/COLA, COLA, or you can get in touch with the Dean's Office at 823-8118. That's 823-8118.
Okay, thanks so much. And let me give you a question as we're going to our break, 757-823-9110. Do you think that African Americans need another leader like Dr. King? And where do you think African Americans would be if Dr. King had continued to leave? We want to hear from you, 757-823-9110. We'll be right back after this break on Hot 91.
Hot 91 commemorates the 90th birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. with a quote from Dr. King. He who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps perpetrate it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it. We commemorate the 90th birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on Hot 91.
Is Hampton Roads Voices on Hot 91.
Welcome back, everybody. If you're just joining us, this is Hampton Roads Voices. And today the question is, where do we go from here? Celebrating the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King. He would be 90 years old today. In the first hour, we heard from Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander. She's the Dean of Norfolk State University's College of Liberal Arts and a historian. And now we welcome our second in-studio guest, Dr. Janira Teague. She's an assistant professor of history here at Norfolk State University. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. So tell us just a little bit in terms of being a professor of history here at NSU. What does that involve? And then we're going to move right into talking about Dr. King.
Sure. It's just wonderful to be a professor here at NSU. This is actually my first year. And I didn't really know what to expect. I had never had an HBCU experience, but I knew the history here and the history of HBCUs. And I feel like the students here really value that history and really champion that everything that I thought students at HBCUs would champion. They're very thoughtful. They know their history. They know the history of students in HBCUs, being a part of movements such as the Civil Rights Movement and working alongside Kings. And they want to take up the mantle and follow in those footsteps. So I really enjoy it, being a professor here in the history department.
Well, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And let me ask you to join the conversation. Our number is 823-9110. Do you think the mission of Dr. King is relevant to younger generations? Where do you think African Americans would be if Dr. King continued to move, such as the I Am a Man movement and the Poor People's Movement? And do you think that African Americans need another leader like Dr. King to progress past poverty in also to be incarcerated, homelessness, and substance abuse? So give us a call. What are your thoughts on this? Mm-hmm. How are you celebrating, participating in the Dr. Martin Luther King holiday? 757-823-9110. So let's talk about how relevant. We heard Dr. Newby Alexander, but from your perspective as a professor of history, how relevant is our celebration of Dr. King?
It is so important. I just think it's so important to celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King because of all that he actually was able to accomplish. And I actually am teaching a class where we compare and contrast the Civil Rights Movement to the Black Power movement to the Black Lives Matters movement. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's so important, and my students said to me, like, why do we celebrate Martin Luther King and maybe not these other leaders in the Black Power movement? And I said, because of everything that he actually accomplished. When you look at the history, and they were very thoughtful, very pragmatic. In the South, there was a segregated South. And Dr. King was able to lead a movement that overturns the segregated South. They're fighting for voting rights, which is so huge. And they were able to fight for and get laws passed so that African Americans could have voting rights. So that legacy is so important. And I believe that students today that might be interested in the Black Lives Matter movement should really think about that past and think about that history. And it's a different movement, but what can you learn from King? What can you learn from those movements so that you can be successful? So King was just so thoughtful and successful in a way that I don't think a lot of other leaders were thoughtful and were successful. So students need to learn from those. And also, ending segregation is huge, and fighting for voting rights is huge. And so students need to think about that because there, unfortunately, are too many students that don't vote and don't understand the power that you get. So students need to celebrate King, and not only celebrate King, but continue that legacy. I mean, he talked about, and during the Civil Rights Movement, they talked about if we have the right to vote, we're not going to need legislation to end lynching because we'll have the power of the ballot to do this. And so there was a very real belief that with the power to vote, we could change so much. And we're seeing so many of our people today not voting. But you need to really understand that people died for that right. People understood how powerful that was. And we need to be active and continue to vote and continue to do the things that Dr. Martin Luther King was advocating. So we need to know that legacy and to champion it and to continue to go.
So you mentioned civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yes.
And so should our audience assume that one builds upon the other one?
Yes. So, I mean, as African Americans, ever since Reconstruction, we're constantly fighting for rights, constantly fighting for equality and rights in this country. And so the same things that they were fighting for during Reconstruction, a lot of those same bigger issues we're dealing with today. And so it's just a continuum. There might be a little bit of a difference in the movements, but it's just a continuum. So I do think one builds upon another. And if you're smart, if you're thoughtful, the students now that are part of Black Lives Matter will look back and say, how can we learn from the civil rights movement? How can we look back and learn from the Black Power movement, and so that we can be successful too? Like I said, there were very real goals. Civil rights leader, we want to end segregation. So what are the real goals of the Black Lives Matter movement? And then once you have those goals, how do we realistically move forward to accomplish those goals, just as King did? So I think they're building, and our students need to look back for inspiration and then do what they want to do and need to do in order to be successful.
So the issues, here's the question. The issues obviously are different.
They are.
But perhaps you're saying the method can be somewhat the same.
Yeah, the issues are. The issues are different. And I don't even know if you need the same method, but to understand the method, understand the strategies and why those strategies were successful. But one thing that's interesting about Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, because I think we really don't understand what he was talking about. I just hate the way we talk about it during MLK Day, because we don't really talk about it the way the King said that speech. But he does mention police brutality in that speech, which is what people are talking about during the Black Lives Matter movement. So yes, in Black Lives Matter, we're not trying to end segregation, although there is still some, you could say there are still places in education where we see that schools are resegregated, and the schools where there's majority African American students aren't doing as well as some of the other schools. So we are, to an extent, dealing with some of those issues, but we're not, we have the right to vote. We legally are not segregated.
Right.
We have completely different issues, even though they were dealing with police brutality back then, but you can still learn from their successful strategies.
They're successful. So we have a caller on the line. The caller called at 757-823-9110. Caller, you're live on the air. What is your name, please, and where are you calling from?
My name is Melissa. I'm calling from Portsmouth, Virginia.
Okay, Melissa, what is your question or comment?
Well, my comment is I was listening to what the history professor was saying when she was speaking on all of the accomplishments of Dr. King, and she didn't really elaborate on the Black Panther Party, but she did mention them. But I think what a lot of people don't really pay that much attention to in regards to Dr. King was that even with all of the accomplishments in his I Have a Dream speech, Dr. King did say before he was murdered, he said, I believe I'm integrating my people into a burning house. And when he started talking about economics, and when he started talking about money, that's when they murdered him. So I kind of paid attention to that aspect of that. I believe if Dr. King was still alive, that he would have taught us how to be financially free, because if you think about it, we really don't own anything. I mean, yeah, we're no longer segregated, but it seems like we're still fighting for the same rights. We're still fighting for it. It's not as blunt as it used to be. It's more systemic now than it was back then. So I do believe that we do need another leader like him, and also some leaders like those of the Black Panther Party, who did take it upon themselves to give back to the community with the breakfast program and the WIC program, which they still use today. So I think it's important for us to pay attention to that aspect as well. He was trying to teach us how to be financially free, and when they noticed that he started doing that, that's when they said, okay.
Okay. Melissa, thank you so much for calling. We appreciate that.
You're welcome. Have a good night.
Okay. Dr. G, what do you think about what Melissa said?
She's actually hitting on the exact point when I was making when I said I don't think we understand the meaning behind the I Have a Dream speech. during that speech, King opens up and he starts talking very first few sentences about the Emancipation Proclamation. And then when he gets into the meat of the speech, he says, and 100 days later, the Negro still is not free. Mm-hmm. And he goes on a whole list, and he's talking about economics. It is the march for jobs and freedom. And that's essentially what this speech is talking about, equality, especially economic equality, and having freedom and having good jobs. That's what it's about. And the part that everybody wants to talk about when King's saying that I want us all to get along, I think we need to think of that in the context. And, I want us to be able to sit next to each other, white kids and black kids. We have to think about that in the context of the segregated South. This isn't, it's not sort of this kumbaya, can't we all just get along type, but it's in segregation. I want to be able to sit at the same lunch counter as Caucasians. I want to not have to go to the back of the door. I want us to get paid equally. I want us to have the same type of jobs. And so that's exactly what I was talking about when I said I don't think we really understand the meaning behind the I Have a Dream speech, because it's talking about wanting equality. There's a lot about economics, and it's not just, can we all get along, and it's can we be equal, especially in consideration of in the South is segregated. That's what he's talking about. Can we watch side by side? We're in a segregated South. So,
but now with the political climate that we have, and some of the issues that are being discussed, and immigration and building walls and so forth, how do we fight equality? How do we continue this particular fight that Dr. King started, that's continued on through the Black Power movement, that has continued on with the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, I think you bring up a great point when you talk about what's going on with immigration. I think one is having allies. And so there's a lot of people in the African American community. Well, actually, I don't like, there are some people that doesn't see the value in, working to actually help immigrants, so I think also having allies, and for each group to support one another, to understand that is what King's talking about, injustice and equality. So if I want to support equality for African Americans, I should also look and see what's going on with Latinos and immigrants and want them to be treated fairly. And then when they see that, they could help come and support our group. But I think the bigger picture, when we're fighting for equality and justice, is just being a little more strategic. So what does that look like? What does that really truly mean in today? So I think a lot of people are talking about really police brutality and the inequality in different police departments. And we do know when people have gone in and looked at police departments, they've actually been able to publish reports showing that these inequalities. We also know there's inequality in the criminal justice center. So that's what a lot of people are talking about. But let's be very strategic, and it's how do we change that, and what are the steps that we need to do to change that? What's ironic is one of the first steps was the First Step Act. I don't know if we've talked about that, but that was a law that was just passed in Congress, which is ironic, and a lot of people don't know that. Just a few weeks ago, and under the Trump administration, we've actually made some inroads into helping the inequity in the criminal justice system. So you need to look at, so that inequity is still there. What do we need to change it? So we've already taken a step with legislation. Let's keep going. Let's keep building on that. So that and it's actually called the First Step Act because it's the first step in changing inequality in the criminal justice system, and keep taking those steps so that we see those changes.
Absolutely. You're hearing from Dr. Janira Teague, an assistant professor of history here at Norfolk State University. So do you think the message of Dr. King is still relevant to younger generations? How are you involving yourself with this change that we say that we want to see? How are you making changes? And what about the movements, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the Black Lives Matter movement? How are you participating in something like that? And if Dr. King was alive, how do you think he would still be leading African Americans? Give us a call, 757-823-9110. This is Hot 91.
Hot 91 commemorates the 90th birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. with a quote from Dr. King. We must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid the power of love. There is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. We commemorate the 90th birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on Hot 91.
It's Hampton Roads Voices on Hot 91.
Welcome back, everybody. We're talking about where do we go from here, celebrating the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King. We have a couple of callers on the line. Caller, where are you calling from, and what is your name? You're live on the air.
Troy Wilkins.
Okay, Troy, what is your question or comment?
I just wanted to make a statement or a comment to the question of how would Dr. King lead in this day and time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we fail to realize that Dr. King was very radical in his approach and how he operated and how he did things. And Dr. King was also very prophetic. So I think that Dr. King in this day and time would still lead from a prophetic standpoint and a religious standpoint, but still hold his radical stance. And basically, I think with social media in this day and time, King would have been able to take his leadership and his ministry to just a different level. And so that's just basically my response. More of a radical. He would still be as radical as he was in his day and time, and still with a strong prophetic voice.
I find that very fascinating. Troy, thank you so much for calling.
No problem.
I love that he's talked about social media. Somehow you don't associate the two, because obviously there was no social media when Dr. King was alive. But just think about that. Troy says that Dr. King was radical and prophetic, and that his leadership and his ministry would have blossomed with social media. So would Dr. King be doing the same thing?
I think that I really think that's a really thoughtful comment, because one of the things that Dr. King did understand wasn't social media, but what was the new technology, which was the television.
Mm-hmm.
That people, were watching TV. And what happens when they're crossing the bridge? They call the news to see young black people getting beaten in the hosing of black people, and that was intentional to get more acknowledgement so people could see what was going on. And that's actually what starts changing the momentum of the movement, is when people with their families are sitting down and they're watching what's going on in front of their television. And people are seeing it for the first time. People
Absolutely.
are just trying to vote, and they're sticking dogs on them, and they're putting hoses on them. And that really does change the support they get, and that changes the movement. So I think, yeah, you're onto something. So with social media and what we're seeing today, I do think they would have used that. So it's the same thing like Black Lives Matters, and we're thinking about police brutality.
Oh, yes.
We think about it so differently now that we see what's going on.
We see it.
And yes, that people are just taking their phones out and they're actually filming this stuff, and people see that and like, look at that injustice. And also, it's a deterrent. All of a sudden now, if a cop pulls somebody over and somebody stops and pulls their phone out because I'm watching you, then they might behave a little different. So I think that's a really good comment. Social media, it really does change things. The way that the TV and people watching the civil rights movement on TV actually changed.
I love that you make that connection there. So we are talking about where do we go from here, celebrating the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King. And it is important for us to think about the changes that have taken place since Dr. King's time and how it is still relevant for us these days, and how the movement is still a part of the process. So do you think the mission of Dr. King is still relevant for younger generations? Give us a call at 757-823-9110. And then do you think Dr. King would have continued to lead African Americans if he was still here today, such as the I Am a Man movement and the Poor People's Movement? That's 757-823-9110. We're also have in studio Dr. Janira Teague, an assistant professor of history here at Norfolk State University. So we've talked a little bit about immigration and the wall and so forth. But is the struggle the same, or is it not?
The struggle that immigrants are going through, or the struggle?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think and I'm also very interested in immigration. That's actually one of the areas that I study, but I look at Black immigration. There's always immigrants coming to and from America, and they're mostly coming to get jobs and to work. And I think what's really interesting about what's going on right now in this moment is like everybody keeps saying like this is a manufactured crisis, because we're talking about these immigrants that are coming across as if they're committing these violent acts and as if they're doing something horrible. When if you really look at the facts, none of the heated rhetoric, but if you really look at the facts, immigrants in America, according to most studies, commit less crime than actually native-born Americans. Most economists, and I'm not trying to have any type of bias, but most economists, whether Democrat or Republican, will say that even though immigrants do use services in the United States, overwhelmingly their contributions to the economy outweigh their negativity. And so what's kind of interesting, and if I think about this as the same way that I think about the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, is how people take what's really going on there. And you get the movement of people, a lot of them are coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, and they are people that are really, think about what you have to be going through to walk, to leave your country and come to America. So we're taking this movement, and we're not really talking about what's really happening. We're trying to vilify people for trying to improve their lives, the same way that people tried to vilify African Americans that were participating in the civil rights movement. So, for instance, when Dr. King is in Birmingham, he writes his letter from a Birmingham jail. He's literally talking and responding to people who are criticizing him for trying to improve his life. And they try to vilify them too. And they try to vilify African Americans too. So there's a way when people are fighting for rights and justice that there's sometimes a pushback. And we try to vilify those people. But underneath, if you really know what's going on, these are just people that are fighting for equality and fighting for rights. The same way that during the civil rights movement, African Americans are trying to fight for a better life. That's what's happening at our border. And so it just is so interesting to me to hear how people talk about them the same ways. And, today we don't think about how people criticize King for just wanting to desegregate.
But what about the person, the African American, that says, look, I'm fighting for what I already built and what was mine. And we're talking about somebody coming from another place. What about that pushback? What about the pushback of that? Saying, I'm only asking for what's mine that I built, that was built on my back.
Their immigrants aren't taking away from, you can work together. I think, I can't say what King believed, but it's about, this wanting to help the poorest among us, wanting to help those in need. When you help the people at the bottom, everybody is pulled up, everybody is strengthened. So it's not about, it's sort of not the crabs in the barrel. We're not trying to bring other people down, but it's, fighting to lift each other up, fighting for the rights of everybody. So if African Americans want to help and fight for more rights for illegals, even illegals in this country, and the amount of money they're getting paid, if they start paying them more to when they're picking fruit, then that helps Americans and the amount of money that they're getting paid and the jobs that they're doing. Or if you fight for more rights from them, the jobs that they're now doing, because they're not getting paid enough, maybe if we fight for the increase in what they're getting paid, other people would start taking those jobs because you can increase their pay. So it's not about looking at other groups and thinking, oh, they're taking from me. That's not what's going on. It's looking at other groups and saying, like, okay, we all need to get up. So let's help each other and lift each other up.
So it's very much the domino effect, not the scarcity mentality. No, this is mine. I need to keep it. You keep yours over there or don't come here. Everything is dependent. Are you saying it's cause and effect more so?
Also, I really want to go back to the 2 points that I've already tried to make at the beginning is, if you look across the board at studies that say, they talk about the economy and immigrants, overwhelmingly immigrants are contributing to this economy and that they're giving more than they're taking away. So they're actually helping the economy. Overwhelmingly, immigrants are commit less crime than Native Americans. So the more immigrants you get, you actually get a society with less crime. So if we were taught and we're hearing people talk about them as if they're bringing all this negativity and all this and these awful things to this country. But the truth is, if you just look at the facts and you're not thinking about the rhetoric, they're actually contributing to society. They're growing the economy. They're not committing as much crime as people think that they're committing. So that actually is a value to everybody. If we look at California, for example, they embraced their immigrant population, and their GDP actually grew more than America's GDP coming out of the recession during the Obama years and during the Bush administration years. So actually, immigrants do actually contribute more. They're not making this country worse. They're really adding to this country. And, so.
And yet, unfortunately, we're not hearing that side of that conversation.
Yeah,
it's fear and scarcity and crime and drugs and those kinds of things.
Yeah, and as African Americans, we should think about, they talked about us a lot of the ways they talk about these immigrants. And when we were fighting for rights and, they tried to vilify us too. So let's not do that to other groups.
Very interesting. So again, we're talking about where do we go from here? Do you think that African Americans need another leader like Dr. King to progress past the poverty and the incarceration, homelessness, substance abuse, the issues that were prevalent in his day? Many of these issues are still prevalent in our day. And as a young person, do you think that you see Dr. King's thoughts and his lifestyle and his ideals? Do you see them differently, perhaps, and as an older generation? What do you think? 757-823-9110. That's 757-823-9110. This is Hot 91.
Is Hampton Roads Voices. Hot 91.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Benita Adams, and we're having a great conversation about Dr. Martin Luther King. He would be 90 this year, and we want to know, where do we go from here? What are some of the issues that you see that are still prevalent and important, especially for the African American community? And do you think that African Americans, that we need another leader like Dr. King to help us progress through some of these issues that we're talking about? We want to hear from you. 757-823-9110. That's 757-823-9110. We are joined in studio by Dr. Janira Teague. She's an assistant professor of history here at Norfolk State University. So, Dr. Teague, during the break we were talking about students leading the movement and not just Dr. King. And that really is a wonderful connection, because obviously we're from Norfolk State University. Talk about that connection there in terms of students leading the movements, and it being grassroots, and why that is relevant to the movements that we see today. Make that connection.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. The civil rights movement, overwhelmingly, it really is a grassroots movement. It starts with people acting. It's bottom up, and King. Well, it's bottom up meets top down. King is a great leader, but when he comes with the Montgomery boycott, there's already activism happening in these communities. And a lot of the activism that's taking place is activism by students. And students are trying to get people registered to vote. And students are fighting to desegregate the South. It's students at HBCUs that sit down and say, we're going to sit in this restaurant and we aren't leaving. Like, you should serve us. And so I don't know if students realize that a lot of the movements that are taking place, or a lot of moves that have taken place in this country, are movements that were started by students, or students were really a significant part of the movement. When you think of civil rights, it wouldn't have been as successful if it wasn't from students during the freedom rides, sitting, just going into restaurants they weren't supposed to be in. And so it's really students that are active and saying that. And it's also because, what they feel like, what do I have to lose? A lot of students, don't have families yet, don't have real jobs. So they're, I'm ready to fight for this. I'm ready to fight for something. And so there were a lot of students that were just very, very active in the movement. I mean, one that I think doesn't get as much credit as Stokely Carmichael. Starts off with the civil rights movement, goes into the Black Power movement. What do we want? Black Power, and so he was a student at Howard. He was a student at HBCU. And we know about the students at North Carolina A&T. So Black students are such a significant part of this movement. And I just think that history is very important, and students should think about that. What are you willing to, what do you want to advocate for? How do you want to make a difference? How do you want to change the world?
How do you want to change the world? So Dr. King attached himself to some things that were already happening.
The movement was already, there's something already going on. Like, there's already activism in place. There are already Black people trying to register to vote. So he is a strong leader. He is. But there's already things happening, and there's already students that are involved. When King becomes the leader.
Right.
He doesn't necessarily start the movement.
Right,
exactly. He comes into the movement.
He comes into the movement,
yes.
Which I think is fascinating. So we know that obviously at colleges, especially HBCUs, and here at Norfolk State University, we have some students listening. I want you to speak directly to them in terms of getting involved with what they believe in, with the principles and the values and things that they find that they really want to change, but maybe never made that leap to making a difference.
Yeah, I think it's, when it comes to Black history, it's always a continuum. It's always a continuum. We're always supposed to stand on the shoulders of giants. We're always supposed to take what the generation before us did and make it better, improve on it. And so the students here, and I can attest to, we have a great history department here, and we're teaching you that history. And now you should take that history and learn from it and use it to improve whatever circumstances that you think needs to improve. So right now, some of the major issues are mass incarceration, police brutality, and so students take in consideration, what we've done in the past, what's worked in the past, and use that when you're thinking about getting involved in these other movements that are going on today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I find that very important because sometimes we say, a person might say, well, what can I do?
Oh, yeah.
What difference does it make? But you even made the point about how powerful it is to vote. And Dr. Newby Alexander, that was our earlier guest from the first hour, mentioned as well, don't give your power away.
Yes.
The power of the ballot.
The power of the ballot. And we talk about that in class. Do not give up. You definitely have to have the right. You definitely have to vote. But not only do you need to vote, but understand the value in what you get from voting. Why is it so important? What's going on in Congress? So pay attention, because a lot of what's happening is actually affecting us, and it's affecting our lives. I remember when the whole Judge Kavanaugh hearing was going on.
Right.
And I started talking about it in my class, and my students here who were so bright, but I had a certain student that said, how does this affect us? And I said, well, he's going to be Supreme Court Justice. They're going to rule on police brutality and injustice in our criminal justice system, affirmative action, all these things that actually affect your lives.
That's
they will actually rule on challenges to laws, So you need to know what's going on. So it's not just about voting, but being aware of why voting is important and what's going on with Congress and how you can make a difference.
That's right. And when we talk about social justice, and I said first guest mentioned that's why local politics are important and who you vote for, because you may never go in front of the Supreme Court, but you will go in front of the judge in Norfolk or Hampton or somewhere in Hampton Roads.
Yes.
And so it is important that we get involved with those kinds of things, because that does affect you personally.
Yes, it does.
So we are talking about celebrating the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King. We're asking, where do you go from here? And we want to know, do you think the mission of Dr. King is relevant to younger generations? Our guest is saying absolutely. And do you think African Americans would want to continue Dr. King leading, such as he did with the Poor People's Movement and the I Am a Man movement? Give us a call, 757-823-9110. This is Hot 91.
Is Hampton Roads Voices. Hot 91.
Welcome, everybody, back to Hampton Roads Voices. We're here in studio with Dr. Janera Teague, Assistant Professor of History here at Norfolk State University, and we're talking about celebrating the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King. And Dr. Teague, I really find it fascinating as you're making this connection between historically making the connection of what Dr. King did, and those movements with even more present movements. Speak to that point one more time, because I really want to make sure if someone is just joining us that they really hear this connection.
Yeah, I started off by talking about a king and his "I Have a Dream" speech. And everybody talks about it, when we're celebrating Martin Luther King Day, but I don't think people understand what he was discussing in that speech. And it was about one thing that we don't necessarily deal with anymore, segregation, but beyond that, he was dealing with the economy and economic inequality that a lot of African Americans are still dealing with to this day. And he also mentions police brutality in that speech. And so the police brutality is really what we're dealing with in the whole Black Lives Matters movement. So there's definitely a connection between what's going on in that movement and what's going on today. And Dr. King talked about, okay, so we're no longer dealing with a legally segregated South. And we have the right to vote. So where do we go from there? And it was wanting equality when it comes to jobs and the amount of money that we're getting paid for our labor. And that's something that African Americans can still vote for. We know there's still disparities in the amount of money that we're making. There's still systematic inequity, systematic racism. So when Black people are applying for jobs, they might be overlooked. So a lot of those issues that people were dealing with during the 60s, we're still dealing with today. And I thought it was interesting when that caller also said that King was a radical. And he was a radical in his own way, but it was just so thoughtful about how he could accomplish these radical goals, but in a way where he could get President Kennedy on his side.
Absolutely.
Where he could get, people of all different races on his side. So it was just very thoughtful and very pragmatic, and that's why he was able to be so successful.
So do we still need an African American leader like that in terms of not mimicking, I guess that's the word I want to use, Dr. King, but being as thoughtful as you said, having the skills, people skills, communication skills, what have you, the knowledge of history, the knowledge of what's going on with in your own communities, to be able to get to the level in which those in power would even listen to you. Yeah,
I do believe we still need a leader like that. And if you can imagine living in the segregated South and having a goal of wanting to end legal segregation, that sounds like a big goal, just like wanting to change inequities and policing of Black people. But King, and like I said, it was a grass-up movement. There are a lot of people, a grassroots movement, so it's not just King. But they were thoughtful in having a strategy to figure out how we can get there.
Right.
And I think that's what we're kind of missing in a lot of the movements. What is this big thing that we're trying to accomplish, and what's the strategy and how we're trying to get there? And one thing that, especially with the bus boycott, capitalism, the economy, we're going to boycott the buses. People are going to lose a lot of money. So that's a strategy that you can use. When everything, even with Colin Kaepernick, we actually saw the opposite. When Nike signed a deal with Colin Kaepernick, all of a sudden Nike stock goes up and Nike starts getting more money. So we can think about, how can we use the economy to actually to meet our goals and to accomplish some of the things that we maybe want to accomplish. They got that during the Civil Rights Movement.
But are people willing to make that economic sacrifice now?
You know what?
What do you think?
I question it, because we're a lot more comfortable. It's one thing if you're walking down the street and if you see somebody of another race, you have to sort of step out of their way, and you have to go through the back door, and you have to go to a school that's not as go to a school that doesn't have that's just not as good as some of the schools other people, or go to you can't even drink out of the water fountain. You that's hitting you in the face, and you have to deal with it. So you're going to fight against that. But sometimes I wonder, are we a little too comfortable? Even though we know there's still systematic racism, we know there's police brutality, but maybe we're getting too comfortable. And King died for the cause, and a lot of people died, and they were willing to die for the cause. And you have to kind of ask, what is our generation? Not even the younger students, but just people alive today, African Americans. What are we willing to die for? And even if we're not willing to die for, what are you willing to go to jail for?
Right.
What are you willing to
sacrifice?
The sacrifice.
That's right.
Yeah.
Those are important thoughts, because I think about that, and I find that very intriguing that you say, are we a little too comfortable? And sometimes we think, you must be kidding if you think I'm going to give this up.
Yeah.
What, think about me and mine.
Yeah.
So the collective, as Dr. Newby Alexander, our first guest, said, she said we have to not think of the individual necessarily, but we must think of the collective, which was a mindset at that time, and a mindset that I believe you need if you're going to be a part of a movement to make change. And so that's so important. So 757-823-9110. 757-823-9110. What are you willing to sacrifice? We're here talking about where do we go from here? Celebrating the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King with Dr. Janira Teague, Assistant Professor of History. So I want to hear about, you were making this amazing connection of Rosa Parks and R. Kelly, and we have it was only three of us hearing it, but now I want everybody to hear it. Make this connection.
I know it sounds so awful when you say it that way. We're making connections from Rosa Parks and R. Kelly, which is
it's like, no,
yeah, that's
not Rosa and R. No, come on. We'll go ahead and make that connection.
Yeah,
I found it fascinating.
Yeah, one of the, I know a lot of people watched the whole Surviving R. Kelly documentary. And one of the themes that that came out during the documentary was how, as a country, as a people, Black women are always devalued. Like, people don't really value their lives, and so they kept asking the question, if R. Kelly was doing this to young white girls, would there have been a difference? How would people have responded?
Right,
so a lot of people said, this was allowed to happen because it was happening to young Black women. And so there's actually a really great book, At the Dark End of the Street, that talks about the civil rights movement from a different standpoint. And it really looks at major leaders in the civil rights movement. And it argues that they started out as actually fighting for the rights of Black women that were raped by white men. And so in the segregated South, that happens a lot.
Yes.
So a lot of Black women, they were raped and allowed to be raped. The criminal justice system didn't do anything about it. And so there was a movement, and there were people involved in a movement that were trying to fight for the rights of those young women, to give them value. And so I think the fact that their lives weren't valued as much and they were allowed to be raped, that's still what we're seeing in today's society. Like, it's not exactly the same, but we still see that we're still fighting for people to show respect to and to value the lives of the young Black women. So that was something they're dealing with during the civil rights movement, and we definitely saw it when we were watching the documentary Surviving R. Kelly. And
that is so interesting. And I had heard that in terms of, had it been white girls,
yes,
would the outcry be different than perhaps what it is now?
Right.
And so that connection is really very important for us to think about. And if you think about rape, power, something being taken away, just the African American community overall, the justice system, mass incarceration, food deserts. You think about that. You don't want to use the word rape in those situations, but it is the power. And it is things that are not available. And so that's why you hear the statement, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. Right. And I appreciate you making that connection there for us. And we do want to tell our listeners that next week we are going to be talking about R. Kelly. And we really want you to call in if you've seen the documentary or if you've heard about it or seen clips online. We know it's going to be a really difficult and challenging conversation, but we absolutely know it is a necessary conversation. And so it is important to let you know that next week we're going to be talking about R. Kelly, but today we've been talking about where do we go from here celebrating Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, some contact information. How can they find you?
Oh, yes. My email is jpteague@nsu.edu.
Absolutely.
So you can contact me.
And the phone number for the history department or... Okay. All right. Anything for social media? Do you know, have anything on social media you like them to follow?
I really don't.
That's okay.
I do not.
Okay. Give that contact, that email address one more time.
Yeah. It's jpteague, which is JPTEAGUE@nsu.edu.
Oh, right. So it really has been a pleasure talking to you today. That was Dr. Janira Teague, Assistant Professor of History here at Norfolk State University. And in our first hour, we heard from Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander. She's the Dean here at Norfolk State University, the College of Liberal Arts, and also a historian. So don't forget, again, next week, we're talking about R. Kelly. Make sure that you tune in and you call in with your questions. Don't forget, we're here every Friday, 5 to 7 p.m., and we have a rebroadcast. It's on Sunday, 12 to 2 p.m. Follow us on social media. That is Hot 91 on a line. You'll find us on Instagram, on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel where you can hear these shows one more time because, again, it's very important as we are talking about things that impact you, impact our community, and impact our world. So thanks so much for joining us. We will see you next time. Have a great evening. The views and opinions expressed on this program are not those of Norfolk State University or WNSB FM. Thank you for listening.